In the archives of a decaying Massachusetts courthouse, buried beneath decades of forgotten paperwork, lies a photograph that should never have been taken. Two young boys, dressed in their finest clothes, pose solemnly beside what appears to be their sleeping brother. But Herbert Prescott wasn't sleeping. He had been dead for 3 days when this image was captured in November 1858. What the camera recorded, however, would later reveal one of the most disturbing family secrets in American history, a bloodline so poisoned by generations of inbreeding that death itself became confused about when to claim its victims. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Prescott family arrived in Salem County, Massachusetts in 1679, part of the wave of English settlers seeking new opportunities in the New World. But unlike other families who spread across the expanding frontier, the Prescotts remained isolated, clustered in a remote valley that locals began calling Prescott Hollow. What started as a close-knit family unit slowly transformed into something far more sinister over the generations that followed. By the 1850s, the family tree had become so tangled that branches seemed to grow back into themselves. Marriage records from the period reveal a disturbing pattern: Prescotts marrying other Prescotts, cousins wedding cousins, uncles taking nieces as wives. The local church registry, preserved in the Salem Historical Society, documents at least 14 marriages between direct blood relatives over a span of just 60 years. When questioned by visiting clergymen about these unions, the family patriarch, Jeremiah Prescott, would simply state that Prescott blood must remain pure. The physical toll of this genetic isolation became increasingly apparent with each generation. Children were born with webbed fingers, misshapen limbs, and minds that never fully developed. The family cemetery, hidden deep in their private woods, contains dozens of small graves marking children who lived only days or weeks. Those who survived to adulthood often displayed peculiar traits: an unusual pallor to their skin, eyes that seemed too large for their faces, and a tendency toward what the family called the sleeping sickness. Herbert Prescott, born in 1842, was considered one of the lucky ones. Unlike his younger siblings who had died in infancy, or his cousin Martha who spent her days rocking in a chair speaking to invisible companions, Herbert appeared normal. He was intelligent, articulate, and showed no obvious signs of the genetic damage that plagued his bloodline. His younger brother George, 9 years his junior, looked up to Herbert as both protector and father figure, especially after their parents succumbed to what the family doctor diplomatically termed consumption of the blood. But the Prescott curse ran deeper than visible deformities or mental incapacity. Something in their corrupted bloodline had begun to affect the very essence of life itself, the boundary between existence and death. Herbert would become the first documented case of what modern geneticists now recognize as a rare hereditary condition that can cause cataleptic states so profound they mimic death itself. The inbreeding hadn't just weakened their bodies, it had created a genetic anomaly that would trap Herbert between life and death in the most horrifying way imaginable. November 1858 brought an early winter to Prescott Hollow, and with it a sense of foreboding that seemed to settle over the isolated homestead like a burial shroud. Herbert, now 16 and bearing responsibilities far beyond his years, had been experiencing strange episodes for weeks. He would suddenly freeze mid-conversation, his eyes staring into nothing, his breathing becoming so shallow it was barely perceptible. These spells, which the family had learned to call Herbert's quiet times, would last anywhere from minutes to hours. George, only 9, but already wise to the family's dark secrets, had begun keeping a crude diary of his brother's condition. In childish handwriting, he documented Herbert's increasingly frequent lapses. Herbert went quiet again today during breakfast. I counted to 300 before he blinked. His skin felt cold like the stones by the well. The boy had developed a ritual of holding a small mirror beneath Herbert's nose during these episodes, watching desperately for any sign of breath fogging the glass. The local physician, Dr. Nathaniel Blackwood had been treating the Prescott family for over 2 decades. He understood their peculiarities and the need for discretion regarding their condition. His medical journals, discovered in 1923 during the demolition of his practice, contained detailed observations of the family's hereditary afflictions. Regarding Herbert specifically, he wrote, "The boy presents with episodes of profound catalepsy that appear to be increasing in both frequency and duration. I fear his bloodline has produced something unprecedented in medical literature." On the morning of November the 14th, Herbert appeared to be in better spirits than he had been in weeks. He helped George with his morning chores, shared stories over breakfast, and even managed to laugh at one of his younger brother's jokes. But as the afternoon wore on, a familiar glassiness crept into his eyes. George noticed it first, the way Herbert's movements became mechanical, as if he were sleepwalking through his daily routine. By evening, Herbert had retreated to his room, complaining of exhaustion. George brought him dinner on a tray, noting how his brother's hands trembled as he ate. "I feel strange tonight, George," Herbert confided, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm watching myself from somewhere far away." Those would be the last coherent words Herbert Prescott would ever speak. When George checked on him the next morning, he found his brother lying perfectly still, eyes closed, face serene, with no detectable signs of life. Dr. Blackwood arrived within the hour, conducting the most thorough examination possible given the medical limitations of 1858. He checked for breath with mirrors and feathers, felt for pulse at multiple points, and even pricked Herbert's skin with needles, all to no response. After nearly 3 hours of testing, he pronounced Herbert Prescott dead, though his private notes reveal significant unease. "I have declared death, though something about this case troubles me deeply. The body shows none of the usual signs of decay, and there is a quality to his stillness that seems expectant." 3 days after Herbert's supposed death, the family arranged for what would become one of the most haunting photographs in American history. Post-mortem photography was common in the 1850s, especially for families who had lost young members, but the Prescott Commission would be unlike any other in photographer James Whitmore's 30-year career. Whitmore had built his reputation photographing the dead throughout Massachusetts, developing techniques that could make corpses appear peacefully at rest, surrounded by grieving family members. He had seen death in all its forms, sudden, prolonged, violent, peaceful. But when he arrived at the Prescott homestead that grey November morning, something felt fundamentally wrong about the scene he was asked to capture. Herbert had been positioned in the family's ornate parlor chair, dressed in his finest suit, with his younger brothers George and Thomas arranged beside him. The family had requested what they called a remembrance portrait, a final image to preserve Herbert's memory. But as Whitmore prepared his equipment, adjusting the heavy glass plates and calculating exposure times, he noticed details that defied his understanding of death. Herbert's skin retained a subtle warmth when Whitmore accidentally brushed against his hand while positioning the chair. More disturbing still was the faint color in Herbert's cheeks, not the waxy pallor of the dead, but something that suggested blood still moved beneath the surface. Whitmore's notes from the session, preserved in his studio records, reveal his growing unease. "The deceased presents most unusually. I have photographed hundreds of corpses, yet never have I encountered one that seemed so present. Several times during the lengthy exposure, I could swear I detected the slightest movement of his chest." Young George appeared almost hysterical during the session, constantly glancing at Herbert, as if expecting him to suddenly sit up and speak. The boy's behavior was so erratic that Whitmore nearly cancelled the sitting entirely. "The child keeps whispering to his brother," Whitmore wrote, as though carrying on a conversation with the dead, most unsettling. What Whitmore couldn't have known was that George had been experiencing vivid dreams since Herbert's apparent death, dreams where his brother called out to him, begging for help, describing a terrible darkness where he couldn't move or speak, but remained terrifyingly aware. The photographic process of 1858 required subjects to remain perfectly still for several minutes while the image was captured on glass plates. Living subjects often struggled with this requirement, moving slightly and blurring the final image. Dead subjects naturally posed no such problem, but as Whitmore worked, he noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Herbert's position had shifted slightly between exposures. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Whitmore's trained eye caught the difference. In the first test exposure, Herbert's hands were folded neatly across his chest. In the second, final image, his fingers had curved slightly, as though grasping for something. When Whitmore mentioned this to Dr. Blackwood, the physician dismissed it as post-mortem settling of the body. But privately, both men shared the same terrible suspicion, that Herbert Prescott might not be as dead as they had pronounced him to be. The completed photograph would later become evidence in one of the most disturbing cases of premature burial in American medical history. But in 1858, it simply stood as a memorial to a boy whose family's cursed bloodline had created something unprecedented in the annals of medicine. Herbert Prescott was buried on November 18, 1858, 4 days after his apparent death, in the family cemetery that lay hidden in the dark woods behind their homestead. The delay was longer than typical for the era, supposedly due to the time required to prepare the ornate oak coffin that the family had commissioned from a craftsman in nearby Salem. But George's diary entries from this period suggest a different reason for the postponement. The family was deeply divided about whether Herbert was truly dead. The boy's crude but haunting entries reveal a household in psychological turmoil. Uncle Silas says Herbert looks too good to be dead. Aunt Prudence keeps checking his mirror for breath clouds. I asked Dr. Blackwood why Herbert's fingernails are still growing, and he told me not to ask such questions. Modern medical knowledge explains that hair and nail growth can continue for days after death, but in 1858, such phenomena only added to the family's mounting dread. The burial itself was a small affair, attended only by immediate family members and Dr. Blackwood. The Prescott family had always been secretive about their affairs, and generations of inbreeding had left them with few connections to the outside world. As the oak coffin was lowered into the rocky New England soil, George later wrote that he heard what sounded like muffled tapping from within the wooden box. When he mentioned this to his uncle, he was told it was merely the settling of Herbert's body and warned never to speak of such things again. But George's nightmares had only just begun. In the weeks following the burial, the boy experienced increasingly vivid dreams that felt more like visitations than ordinary sleep disturbances. He would wake in the middle of the night, convinced he heard Herbert calling his name from somewhere deep underground. His diary entries from this period grow increasingly frantic. Herbert came to me again last night. He was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't understand the words. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out. He looked so frightened. Dr. Blackwood, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation into the Prescott family's medical history. What he discovered in church records and family Bibles horrified him, a genetic legacy so compromised by inbreeding that it had produced conditions he had never encountered in medical literature. His private correspondence with colleagues at Harvard Medical School reveals his growing certainty that the family carried hereditary traits that could cause states of suspended animation indistinguishable from death by contemporary diagnostic methods. The local community began to whisper about strange occurrences in Prescott Hollow. Farm animals refused to graze in the fields near the family cemetery. Travelers reported hearing cries coming from beneath the ground, though they attributed these to the wind moving through the trees. Most disturbing of all, several residents claimed to have seen a figure matching Herbert's description walking through the woods at night, always moving toward the cemetery, always vanishing when approached. George's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would spend hours sitting by Herbert's grave, conducting one-sided conversations with the earth. Family members found him there one morning, his hands bloody from clawing at the frozen ground, insisting that he could hear his brother scratching at the coffin lid from below. When Dr. Blackwood examined the boy, he noted symptoms of severe psychological trauma, but also wondered if George might be experiencing some form of psychic connection to his buried brother, a phenomenon that would later be documented in cases involving twins and other close genetic relatives. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, What would you have done if this was your bloodline? By spring of 1859, George Prescott's condition had deteriorated to the point where Dr. Blackwood feared for the boy's sanity. The child had stopped eating, barely slept, and spent most of his waking hours describing detailed conversations with his dead brother, but it was George's increasingly specific descriptions of Herbert's supposed underground experiences that finally convinced the doctor to take drastic action. "Herbert says the wooden box is getting smaller," George told Dr. Blackwood during one of their sessions. "He says his fingers are bleeding from trying to push up the lid. He says he can hear us talking sometimes, especially when it rains and the water seeps down." These weren't the vague fantasies of a grieving child. They contained details about coffin construction and burial practices that no 9-year-old should have known. Dr. Blackwood made the unprecedented decision to recommend exhumation. The family initially resisted, but George's deteriorating mental state and the doctor's persistent concerns about the unusual circumstances of Herbert's death eventually swayed them. On May the 3rd, 1859, nearly 6 months after the burial, a small group consisting of Dr. Blackwood, 2 local laborers, and several family members gathered at Herbert's graveside with shovels and lanterns. What they discovered when the coffin was finally unearthed and opened would haunt every witness for the remainder of their lives. Dr. Blackwood's official report, preserved in the Massachusetts Medical Society archives, describes the scene in clinical terms that barely contain the horror of what they found. The deceased had clearly regained consciousness post-burial. Evidence of desperate struggle was immediately apparent. The interior of the coffin side was gouged with deep scratches, clearly made by human fingernails. Splinters of wood were found embedded under what remained of Herbert's fingernails, and his hands were positioned above his head, pressed against the coffin lid in a final, futile attempt at escape. But perhaps most horrifying of all was Herbert's position within the coffin. He had been buried, lying peacefully on his back, arms crossed over his chest. When the coffin was opened, his body was contorted, knees drawn up, head twisted to one side, arms extended upward, as though he had been pounding on the wooden barrier above him. The fabric of his burial suit was torn in several places, consistent with violent thrashing movements. Most disturbing of all, Herbert's mouth was open in what appeared to be a silent scream, and his eyes, which had been gently closed at burial, were wide with an expression of absolute terror. Dr. Blackwood noted in his report that the body showed clear signs of asphyxiation, not the peaceful natural death they had originally diagnosed. George's reaction to these findings was immediate and shocking. Rather than the hysteria the adults expected, the boy became perfectly calm for the first time in months. "He's not calling to me anymore," George said simply, staring down at his brother's contorted remains. "He's finally quiet." The child's nightmares ceased immediately following the exhumation, but he would never fully recover from the psychological trauma of having unknowingly listened to his brother's underground death struggle for 6 months. Dr. Blackwood's investigation revealed that Herbert had likely regained consciousness within hours of being buried. The scratches on the coffin lid suggested he had fought for his freedom for days, possibly even weeks, before finally succumbing to suffocation and dehydration, the realization that they had condemned a living boy to one of the most horrific deaths imaginable would drive 2 of the family members present at the exhumation to take their own lives within the year. The Herbert Prescott case forced Dr. Blackwood to confront a medical reality that challenged everything he thought he knew about death itself. His subsequent research into the family's genetic history revealed a pattern of inbreeding so extensive that it had essentially created a new form of hereditary catalepsy, a condition where the victim could enter states of suspended animation so profound that they appeared clinically dead by the diagnostic standards of the 1850s. Working with colleagues at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Blackwood traced the Prescott bloodline back to its origins in Salem County. What he discovered was a family tree so twisted by generations of cousin marriages that the genetic pool had become catastrophically shallow. The original Prescott patriarch, Jeremiah, had married his own niece in 1695. Their children had married each other and their cousins, creating a pattern of genetic isolation that continued for over 160 years. The medical consequences of this inbreeding had manifested in various ways throughout the generations: stillbirths, mental deficiency, physical deformities, and unusual neurological conditions. But Herbert represented something unprecedented, a genetic anomaly that could trigger cataleptic states indistinguishable from death. Dr. Blackwood's research revealed that at least 3 other Prescott family members over the previous century had been buried after suspiciously sudden deaths with no apparent cause. In his landmark paper presented to the New England Medical Association in 1860, Dr. Blackwood described what he termed Prescott syndrome, a hereditary condition that could cause victims to enter states of such profound unconsciousness that breathing and pulse became virtually undetectable. Unlike normal catalepsy, which was well documented in medical literature, this condition appeared to be triggered by stress or illness, and would last for days or even weeks. The paper included detailed analysis of the family's marriage records, birth certificates, and death records going back 5 generations. The pattern was undeniable, a closed genetic system that had amplified rare neurological traits to the point where they became dominant characteristics. Dr. Blackwood theorized that the same genetic factors that caused the family's various physical and mental abnormalities had also created a unique form of catalepsy that mimicked death so completely that even trained physicians could be fooled. Modern genetic analysis of preserved Prescott family records has confirmed Dr. Blackwood's suspicions. The family carried multiple recessive genes that, when combined through inbreeding, could produce a rare neurological condition affecting the autonomic nervous system. This condition could cause breathing and heart rate to slow to almost imperceptible levels while maintaining basic brain function, essentially trapping the victim in a conscious but paralyzed state. What makes the Herbert Prescott case particularly tragic is that this condition was not necessarily fatal. With proper medical intervention, primarily ensuring adequate breathing and nutrition, victims could recover completely from cataleptic episodes. But in 1858, buried 6 feet underground in an airtight coffin, Herbert had no chance of survival once he regained consciousness. He died not from his genetic condition, but from the medical ignorance of his era. The psychological implications of Herbert's experience remain almost too horrific to contemplate. Modern researchers estimate that he was likely conscious and aware for the entire duration of his underground imprisonment. He would have understood exactly what had happened to him, known that he had been buried alive by mistake, and realized that his family believed him to be dead. The mental anguish of that realization, combined with the physical agony of slow suffocation, represents one of the most nightmarish deaths ever documented in medical literature. The discovery of Herbert Prescott's true fate sent shockwaves through the medical community that extended far beyond New England. Dr. Blackwood's findings were published in medical journals across America and Europe, fundamentally changing how physicians approached the diagnosis of death. The case became required study in medical schools, not just as an example of diagnostic error, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of genetic isolation. The Prescott family itself never recovered from the revelation. George, though freed from his nightmares, remained psychologically scarred for life. He never married, never had children, and spent his remaining years obsessively documenting his family's genetic history in an attempt to prevent future tragedies. His handwritten journals, discovered in the ruins of the family homestead in 1923, contain hundreds of pages detailing the physical and mental abnormalities that plagued each generation of Prescotts. The family line effectively ended with George's death in 1891, the few remaining Prescott cousins scattered across the country, abandoning the cursed name and attempting to escape their genetic legacy. The homestead in Prescott Hollow was abandoned and eventually reclaimed by the Massachusetts wilderness, though locals reported strange phenomena in the area for decades afterward. Unexplained sounds from the family cemetery, sightings of figures moving among the overgrown graves, and a persistent feeling of unease that seemed to permeate the very soil. The post-mortem photograph of Herbert and his brothers became one of the most studied images in the history of forensic medicine. When examined with modern photographic enhancement techniques, experts have identified subtle signs that Herbert was indeed alive when the picture was taken. The slight tension around his eyes, the barely perceptible color in his skin, and most disturbingly, evidence of muscle tension that would be impossible in a true corpse. Perhaps most chilling of all, advanced digital analysis has revealed what appears to be the faintest suggestion of movement in Herbert's fingers during the long exposure required for the 1858 photograph. Some experts argue this could be explained by natural post-mortem processes, but others believe it represents the last conscious movements of a boy trapped in a living nightmare, unable to signal his desperate need for help. The Herbert Prescott case influenced medical practice for generations. Mandatory waiting periods before burial became standard procedure, and new techniques for confirming death were developed specifically to prevent similar tragedies. The case also contributed to the Victorian era's growing fear of premature burial, spawning an entire industry of safety coffins equipped with bells, breathing tubes, and other devices designed to allow the accidentally buried to signal for help. Modern genetics has revealed that the Prescott family's condition was likely caused by a combination of rare recessive genes that became concentrated through generations of inbreeding. Similar conditions have been documented in other isolated populations, though none as severe as what the Prescotts experienced. The family's tragic legacy serves as a stark reminder of the biological consequences of genetic isolation and the importance of genetic diversity in human populations. Today, the original photograph of the Prescott brothers resides in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution, where it continues to disturb visitors and researchers alike. Those who study the image often report feeling an inexplicable sense of unease, as though Herbert's trapped consciousness somehow remains present in the captured moment. Whether this is merely the power of suggestion or something more profound remains a mystery that continues to fascinate those brave enough to look deeply into the eyes of a boy who died twice, once in the world of the living and once in the darkness beneath the earth, where no one could hear him scream. The story of Herbert Prescott reminds us that the most horrifying tales are often not fiction, but the documented realities of our past, moments when ignorance, tragedy, and genetic misfortune combine to create nightmares that no human being should have to endure. His legacy lives on not just in medical textbooks, but as a haunting reminder that sometimes the worst monsters are not supernatural beings, but the limitations of human knowledge and the cruel indifference of fate itself.